On what to look for in a California bill analysis. Now, as you might think, there are several different types of bill analyses used in the California Legislature. The first distinction is that there are committee and floor analyses of bills. Second, at the committee level, there are analyses prepared by the policy and fiscal committees. And of course, there are analyses prepared by committees and the floor in the Senate and in the Assembly. And these different types of analyses serve different purposes for different audiences. Now, in most instances, the most substantive analyses are obviously prepared by the policy committees in the Assembly and Senate. Nonetheless, even these can differ significantly. For example, some are short versions, typically 3 to 4 pages in length, and there are longer versions, sometimes reaching 20 to 25 pages and even more. The fiscal committee analyses, which are focused obviously on the fiscal impacts of bills, are typically 1 to 3 pages in length. And then floor analyses can be anywhere from a few pages to a number of pages in length, depending on how many provisions are contained in the bill. Each of these analyses are necessary to address critical aspects of the bills that are being analyzed by the policy and fiscal committees. And they're designed for their audiences, legislators, staff, advocates, and the general public, all of whom are concerned with either the policy or fiscal implications of a bill. Now, in addition, readers should be aware that the Democratic and Republican caucuses in both the Senate and the Assembly prepare their own private analyses for their respective party members. And these usually contain summaries of the key provisions of a bill, comments that may be in line with party ideology, and listing of proponents and opponents of the bill. Between committee and floor analyses, most bill analyses produced for the floor of the Assembly or Senate usually are shortened versions of a combined policy and fiscal analysis. They address in summary fashion the key policy and fiscal aspects of the bill. There are a few differences between how the Assembly and Senate prepare their floor analyses. For example, one of the most common cited differences is that the Senate floor analysis includes a list of supporters and opponents of the bill, while the Assembly version does not. So, how should you read to understand a bill analysis in the California legislature? So, all committee analyses reference critical information right at the top: name of the committee, the hearing date, the bill number and author, the subject matter of the bill, the vote required, and the version of the bill. Is it introduced or which amended version? Because obviously that's what the analysis is based upon. Thereafter, the analyses provide relevant information for the reader. In most instances, the policy committee analyses address a number of key questions, such as what is existing law in this subject area? What's the intent behind the proposed legislation? What is the legislation proposed to do? Does it create new rights or benefits? Does it prohibit, regulate, or impose obligations? Does it authorize or permit conduct? Does it apply prospectively or retroactively? What are the arguments for and against the bill? Who supports and opposes the measure? In preparing a legislative bill analysis, the committee consultants first naturally read the bill and they identify key information contained in the bill, which will then be set forth in their analysis. This provides valuable information for the reader of the analysis. And for California bills, the first page or two of a bill usually contains this information. As I mentioned, the bill number and bill's author, the date of introduction, the date of the amendment, whether it's adding, amending, or repealing code sections. What's the vote requirement for the bill's passage? What are the possible fiscal implications of the bill? Does it contain a state mandated local program, for example, or any cost associated with it? The introduction or amendment date is noted in the analysis because each time a bill is amended, the language naturally changes, and references are always made to the date of the amended version when describing the bill's version and referring to its provisions in the bill analysis. The bill analysis naturally has to be completed based upon the most recent version of the bill. Now, staff usually read the Legislative Council's digest in the bill, which first sets forth existing law on the subject matter, and then it provides a brief summary of the changes a proposed bill will make to current law if it's adopted. Now, committee staff do not rely entirely on this summary, even as a primary source of information, but it's to get acquainted with the area of law and the bill's proposed provisions. But they really rely instead upon reading and thoroughly understanding not only the bill language, because that's what becomes law, but all the relevant background information, sometimes contained in the committee information sheet or the so called committee backgrounder, other times through independent research of the individual consultants of the committees. So when you're reviewing to understand a bill analysis, look in the committee analysis for relevant statements of legislative intent from the bill. It's usually replicated in the bill analysis, and in fact, many analyses provide a section titled the author's statement, for example, and this can help guide those who must comply with the new law or the law changes made by the bill, as well as for the courts to make determinations in future litigation about what was intended by the bill. Legislative intent can guide interpretation and implementation of a particular statute, especially when a bill is lengthy, complicated, or in some cases ambiguous. As a result, there's a lot of focus on this section when reading the analysis. And often these analyses identify any language in the bill that elaborates on the purpose or the goals of the proposed legislation to help the reader understand the context and purpose of the bill. Legislative intent can sometimes be found at the beginning of the bill in such phrases that begin with, it's the intent of the legislature to do the following, or the legislature finds and declares the following. However, there may not always be such explicit statements of intent in the bill itself. Committee consultants also consult statements in support of or in opposition to the bill, as well as other relevant analyses of the measure, such as those prepared by a state agency or department, or even a committee in the other house. The analysis also might rely upon things like press releases, testimony submitted, other sources of information that the staff have obtained. They also review again in detail the letters of support and opposition, reports or studies prepared, and other relevant materials regarding the bill that they're analyzing so that these different sources of information can be identified and relied upon in the analysis. When reviewing the bill's provisions, and in the analysis, they'll note any statements imposing requirements, prohibiting or permitting certain conduct, or other such relevant provisions. The bill analysis will focus on these statements and discuss them and then help the reader determine to whom its provisions apply. So in this regard, the bill analysis often helps answer questions such as what action might be required or that's prohibited or even permitted, who is directly impacted by the bill's provisions and other such questions. The committee analysis usually clearly and thoroughly discusses existing law that's being changed, either amended or repealed, what impact the bill would have on existing law or existing programs if it were enacted. The analysis often identifies substantive changes, noting things that, is it a may? So is it permissive or a shall where it's mandatory? When the committee consultants are analyzing a bill, their written analysis describes the circumstances surrounding the need and the proposed enactment of this particular bill. Things like what led to its introduction, whose interests are being impacted, the goals of the legislation. The purpose of understanding the context of the bill will enable the reader of the analysis to appreciate the critical question of what problem the legislation is attempting to address in this particular measure. Now, after setting forth the specific provisions of the proposed legislation, those reading the bill analysis will find additional information that explains the background of the measure. For example, the analysis of the bill may address questions such as, are there any applicable court decisions? Have there been previous efforts to pass similar or related legislation? If so, what happened to those measures? Was the language the same or similar or entirely different in those prior bills? Some committee analyses include a comments section. These are offerings from the committee consultant who's analyzing the bill. They may raise important policy or fiscal considerations that legislators should consider before voting on the bill. In this comments section, there may also be suggested technical amendments, maybe suggestions for defining certain terms, or other proposed amendments. For example, those that have been suggested by a relevant department or agency. Now, finally, the policy committee analyses, but again, not the fiscal ones, provide a list of the supporters and opponents of the bill, as well as a summary of the proponents and opponents' arguments. And often the committee consultant will actually quote from one or more support and opposition letters in their analysis. And it's important for legislators, staff, and of course the public to know the arguments pro and con on a particular bill and which groups are in favor or against the bill. Readers should also be aware that there are, again, other bill analyses that are prepared by California agencies and departments, including the Department of Finance for measures that have an economic impact to the state. Note, however, that these analyses only become public if the governor's office authorizes a position to be made public. Now, these state governmental entity analyses usually follow this format: a summary of the bill, next, the reason for the bill, an analysis of existing law, an analysis of this particular bill's provisions, perhaps legislative history, some background on the program that's being impacted, other states' information, if there are other states that have similar law or program, the fiscal impact, the supporters and opponents, and usually conclude with arguments pro and con. Writing bill analyses is a critical component of the California legislative process because these analyses explain the substance of what is contained in proposed legislation so that legislators and their staff, interest groups, advocates, and members of the general public can be aware of proposed law changes. Now, again, while there are different types of bill analyses, they all serve the same function, which is to inform both interested parties and ultimately decision makers who have to cast a vote on those bills.